Grief is one of the most powerful, complex, and deeply personal experiences you will ever go through. It can sometimes feel like an overwhelming wave. It can knock you off balance when you least expect it. And yet, it is something that we all experience at some point in our lives. In today's episode, I'm opening up about my own journey with grief, the raw, the real, and the unexpected moments that changed me. I'll also be sharing some tools and insights that can help you move through grief rather than feeling stuck in it. Whether you're grieving a loss, a season of life, or even a version of yourself you've had to let go of, you are not alone. Let's have an honest, compassionate conversation about grief, how we process it, how we honor it, and how we slowly begin to feel light again. Take a deep breath, grab a cozy drink. Let's get to it. Welcome to the Lemon Balm Coaching Podcast, your cozy corner of the world where we'll sip on life's lessons and squeeze the most out of every moment. I'm Melissa, your coach, cheerleader, and maybe even a little bit like that mom who always has a warm hug and the best advice waiting for you. If you're a woman over 40, feeling like life's left you a little lost, aimless, or downright stuck, you're in the right place. This is where your joy, your freedom, and your purpose come back into focus. Together, we'll laugh, learn, and rediscover what makes you come alive because it's not too late. This is your time. So grab a cup of something warm, settle in, and let's start creating the next most beautiful chapter of your life together. I think when we hear the term grief, we always think about losing a loved one, the death of a loved one, someone that we love passing away, whether it has 2 legs or 4 legs or no legs, irrelevant. We always kind of think, I feel like we think it's about the loss of that individual. But grief isn't always about the death of a loved one. It literally can be about losing a job, moving away from somewhere that you've loved, being connected in some way, and then losing that connection. Grief covers all of those things and more. It's not always about physical death. And I really feel like that's something that we don't remember in our daily lives. It could be grief over losing a former version of yourself, like I said in the intro. It can be about anything. It can be about relationships. It can be about losing your favorite food. What if you woke up tomorrow and you could no longer eat the foods that you love? I've had that happen with friends of mine. Friends of mine have gotten sick and they've had to go through elimination diets and realize they can't eat the things that they've always loved. Personally, I can't eat the things that I love because they are not good for me. And one of the things that I find kind of interesting and sad about myself is I never really grieved before a couple of years ago. Here I am in my mid-50s, and grief was something that was really foreign to me. And even though I didn't really experience it myself, I didn't allow myself to experience it, I understood it, and I could have empathy for other people going through grief. But I never allowed myself to grieve. And it was actually a survival mechanism for myself. When we're younger, I remember I had a really good friend up until I was 11 years old, and then we moved, and that was really hard. And I think it was after that that I just stopped allowing myself to grieve. And I do remember coming up against other things in my life that I had lost, through my teen years and stuff like that, and how hard it hit. And I would just close myself off, not allow myself to grieve, because if I didn't feel it, it didn't hurt, right? But the problem with that is when we shut ourselves off to emotions that we consider bad emotions like grief, when we shut ourselves off to emotions, we shut ourselves off to everything. I didn't realize it at the time, but after my physical breakdown, I realized, not allowing myself to feel those things and holding it all inside and allowing that energy to become trapped in my body led to my physical breakdown. My physical breakdown didn't just happen. I mean, it was years in the making. And I'll share more about that in another episode coming up. I'll share more about what I went through, my experiences, but shutting all that stuff off harmed me in a major way. So when I was younger, right, I didn't allow myself to grieve. I would shut it off, pretend it wasn't happening, and move on, right? Move on. Keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. Run, 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 run from that grief, right? Run from the pain. And I think back, and again, this is something I realized just recently, but I think back out of all of the moves that we've done, because we're former military family. We moved every 3 years like clockwork, right? Create new friends and then leave, create new friends and then leave, create new friends and then leave. Get involved in organizations, get involved in just, and then leave. And I never really grieved the leaving. I typically would start shutting myself off about 6 months before leaving so that we could just leave. No big deal. It's just time to move. Oh, well, bye, friends. Hopefully, we'll stay in touch. Maybe, maybe not. But I didn't grieve. We just kept moving. I kept moving. I kept moving. I kept moving. And I kept stuffing and I kept stuffing. So much so that even when my mom passed away, yeah, I cried, but I don't believe I allowed myself to really, truly grieve because I'd gotten so good at shutting it off. I had gotten so good at shoving it down. I had gotten so good at not letting things bother me. I was fine. My sister would ask me, "Do you miss mom sometimes?" And I'm like, "No, not really." And she can't understand that because she's much more in tune with her emotions than I am, or than I used to be anyway. And I didn't grieve. I remember very clearly because my mom was non-responsive at this time. I remember very clearly saying to her, "I know you're a prideful woman and you don't want us to see your passing. So I'm going to lay down here and I'm going to, close my eyes, take a little rest, and you are free to go." And about 10 minutes after I did that, she breathed her last. And I heard the death rattle. If anyone's ever been at the bedside, you know what that is. And I heard the death rattle. I woke my dad up and I said, "This is it. She's leaving." And we, came together around her bed and we were with her when she passed. There are stages of grief that people typically go through, right? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I skipped all of those. I skipped the denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression, and I immediately went to acceptance in like all of these situations. Every time we would move, anytime a pet would pass away, anytime someone I loved would pass away, I would just go past all of those other stages and immediately to acceptance. But I know for me, it was about protection. I was protecting myself. I was protecting my heart and shutting all of that off and shoving it down, moving right past all those other stages and going straight to acceptance. Well, it was their time for them to go. No big deal. That sounds so callous now that I look back at it. But that's where I was at that time. But I had my first true grief experience as an adult when my brother passed away 2.5 years ago. In the last episode, my sister and I talked a little bit about our brother. I look at grief like an ocean. We used to live on Guam, surrounded by an ocean, little island out in the middle of the Pacific. And there were some beaches where the waves were nice and gentle. And then there were other beaches that would crash. The waves would just crash. And that's kind of the way grief is. Sometimes it's crashing. Sometimes it knocks you off balance. And sometimes it's just this gentle, soothing covering. And when my sister and I were talking about my brother in the last episode, that brought forward some of those gentle grief waves. Sunday in church, we sang a song I'd never heard before, so I don't even remember the tune, but I can read to you what the lyrics were. "Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. It chases me down, fights till I'm found, and leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I didn't deserve it. Still, you gave yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God." And as I was singing this song, just waves of grief about my brother were coming back in. And then, of course, it had me thinking about my entire grief journey as it surrounds my brother. So we were living on Guam. I'm going to go ahead and share this story with you. We were living on Guam, and I was coming back to the States to visit. I had a retreat to go to, and then I was going to stay for about a month and go visit family and friends all over the United States. We've got people everywhere. So after my retreat, I went to visit our oldest son in Northern California. I stayed there for about a week. And then I flew to, where did I go next? I flew to Florida to visit my dad. And my brother, he was going to meet me in Florida and take a little road trip with me. I was going to, my dad had been caring for my car while I was overseas, but I was going to take it up to my son in North Carolina. And my brother was going to join me on that road trip because I love road trips. He loves road trips. And he was just so excited to be able to spend time with me as an adult. We'd never really spent a lot of time together as adults. We didn't have the best relationship as kids, as, most people probably have that experience. And then as we became adults, we each went our own ways and we did our own things and raised our families, et cetera, et cetera. So we didn't really have a whole lot of time together. And he reached out to me when he found out I was coming back and what my plans were, and we were going to road trip together. I was so excited about that. So I'm at my dad's. I had just gotten to my dad's probably an hour before the phone rang. And he called to let us know that they found a tumor in his colon and he was going in for surgery to have the blockage removed because it was cancer. And my dad and I flew out to Las Vegas to be there for his surgery. And it was a beautiful time at his bedside. And that was the beginning of his cancer journey. And his cancer was diagnosed, and 84 days later, he passed away. But we got the call from my sister-in-law that his time was coming close to an end. So I flew back to the United States to be at my brother's bedside. I had no return date. It was an open-ended ticket. And I had been, up until this point, I had been doing so much personal work. I had worked with a therapist. I had worked with coaches. As an aromatherapist, I used my aromatherapy tools. As a holistic intuitive healer, I did what I could for myself. It's always hard to work for yourself. It's so important to have other people who can speak into your life, which is why I was working with coaches to help me become a better me. When he passed away and the days leading up to his passing, I allowed myself to feel. I allowed myself to be present. I allowed myself to just experience being there. It's not like I'd never been with someone who'd passed away before. I have. I've been with people who've passed away. I used to volunteer for hospice. I've been there at the bedside. But this was the first time I actually allowed myself the chance to grieve, the chance to feel the weight of his passing. And then fast forward another year, and we got word that my husband's time at his office in Guam was done, and we were going to be moving back to the States. Well, I'd moved so many times before. No big deal, right? No big deal. Well, this time it was, because I had allowed myself to experience my emotions. Working with my coaches, I had learned to connect with my emotions. I believe that we are all born sensitive beings, every single one of us. Because the reason I believe that is because we need our senses to survive this life. We have to be able to feel, hear, see, touch, smell. We have to be able to do those things to be able to get through this life. How do you know something's hot if you can't feel that it's hot? Like, we need our senses. And when we're lacking a sense, the other senses are heightened. We are all born sensitive beings. We are meant to experience the full range of human emotion on this planet. That's part of our sensing. That's part of our ability to survive. So I had learned to allow myself to feel again. So here we are leaving Guam, and I'm thinking to myself, no big deal. This is fine. We've moved so many times before. But this is the first time. We've been back in the States for a couple of years now, but I miss it. I actually grieve leaving Guam. I miss Guam. I miss my friends there. I miss my experience of the island. This is the first time I've ever missed somewhere that I've moved from. This is the first time I've ever longed to go back to somewhere. And it's because I now allow myself to actually feel emotions. Grief is an emotion. Grief is something we need to allow ourselves to feel, to again have that full experience of being human. But how can you move through the stages of grief? How can you make it through and still be okay? Because that feeling of loss, again, going back to the very beginning, whether it's a person, a pet, a place, an experience, regardless of what it is, how in the world can you manage the heaviness of that grief? There are a lot of ways. And you know what? You can do a Google search. There are podcasts about grief. There are coaches that focus on grief. There are therapists that focus on grief. There is so much out there about grief. But my personal experience of grief, the thing that helped me the most, I was participating in a mentorship program here where I live. And the topic that we were talking about was death one day. And I shared this experience of being at my brother's bedside, but I also shared that I'm still struggling with it. And here it is, a year and a half, 2 years later, still struggling with it. And at the time that I was in this mentorship program, and all my aromatherapy friends out there might understand this, I was experiencing phantasmia. Now, that's a fancy word for olfactory hallucination. As I was going through this mentorship program, this went on for a couple of months. I was smelling cigarette smoke, constantly smelling cigarette smoke. Now, there's a number of possible reasons to experience phantasmia. It could be like sinus infection, migraines, head injuries, but I was experiencing it because of the loss. I was experiencing this phantasmia because my brain was struggling to make sense of this loss, to get through this grief. But I'm smelling this cigarette smoke constantly. And it was just the weirdest experience. And when I shared that in the mentoring group, my mentor, he said, well, have you worked your way through the grief? And I was like, well, not really. So he suggested, and this is my first suggestion for you if you're working through grief yourself, is to write a letter. And not just a letter about the grief, right? Not that. A letter, I wrote a letter to my brother about all of the wonderful things I remember about him, all of the fun that we had growing up, the experiences that we shared. And it was really cathartic to write it all down and get it out of my head and out of my heart. Because when you write things, physically write things with your hand, you use a different part of your brain. It wakes up new neural connections and new pathways. So writing that letter was a huge part of my grief process. So if you're going through a stage of grief, and again, doesn't matter what it's related to, and I want to tell you this also, no one can tell you, and I want you to hear this, no one can tell you that something is not worth grieving, nor can they tell you how long your grief should last. Everyone on this planet is unique. Everyone is different. Every relationship we have, every connection that we make is unique to us. No one can tell you what is worth grieving, and no one can tell you how long grief should last. No one. Do not let anyone ever tell you that. I had a friend one time, an older lady whose husband passed away. And I was friends with one of her children. She called me one day really, really, really upset. And this was several months after the passing of her husband. She called me really upset because her children were telling her that she needed to change the message on her answering machine because they didn't like calling and hearing their dad's voice. It was very hard for them. Well, I told her, I said, you know what? That is your husband's voice. And she told me it gives her comfort to hear the voice. I said, you tell your kids stop calling if it's too hard for them, because that's what's making it possible for you to get through the grief. Don't let anyone tell you how long grief should last. But writing that letter to my brother was a huge part of my grief process. So if you're going through a grief process, maybe writing a letter could be cathartic for you as well. Like I said earlier, there are therapists that focus on grief. There's coaches that focus on grief. There are people who can walk beside you as you move through your grief. Just find ways to invite joy into your life. Find ways to bring joy into the grief. I know that sounds crazy, but it's totally possible. It is totally possible to find joy even through grief. Grief takes its own time. Don't let anybody tell you how long your grief should last. And the timing is different for everyone. And the timing is different for each grief situation. Just because it took, 6 months for you to grieve one thing doesn't mean that's what it's going to be every single time. Because again, you are unique. The people, the animals, the things that you connect with are unique to you. Every single one of them is going to have its own grieving period. And be gracious with yourself. Be gentle with yourself as you move through the stages, as you allow grief its time. But the other thing I want to encourage you to do through grief is seek presence at all times. Seek presence at each of the stages of grief, whether you go through them quickly or you take your time moving through the stages. Go through each stage with presence. And I actually have a gift for you that might help. What if you could slow down through the grief? What if you could breathe through the grief? And I know this sounds kind of counterintuitive, but what if you could actually enjoy the moment that you're in? Because sometimes grief is remembering the good things, right? But what if you could actually enjoy that moment without feeling guilt or without feeling stressed? How great would that be? And that's exactly why I created 5 ways to practice presence. It's a free guide for you to help you feel more grounded and connected, reduce the overwhelm of the grief in just a few minutes a day, and to experience more peace, joy, and clarity no matter where you are, whether you're going through grief or you're just moving through life. Presence isn't about doing more. I want you to hear that. Presence is not about doing more. It's about fully living in the moments that you have right now. And this guide gives you simple, practical ways to bring more mindfulness and calm into your everyday life, starting right now. So if you're ready to stop rushing through everything, especially the grief, right? Like I used to do, moving right to acceptance. If you're ready to stop rushing through it and start truly living it, just download 5 ways to practice presence today. And I will include that link in the show notes. It's yours. It's free. Just go grab it. And I want you to breathe in and exhale and allow grief its time. One more thing I want to tell you before we close today. If you are not experiencing grief right now, but you have someone in your life who is, this is something that I found so helpful when I was outside of grief, right? Remember at the beginning, I said I didn't allow myself to grieve, but I could have empathy towards those who were and understand their experience. I had a friend, this is a long time ago, decades ago, whose husband passed away. And I didn't reach out to her right away. And the reason I did that intentionally, because in the moments immediately following the grief moment, whether that's the passing of someone or the moving or whatever it is, usually in those first 2 weeks, everybody and their pet monkey is reaching out. How can I help? Let me know if you need anything. Blah, blah, blah. Here's some food. Here's a card. Here's some flowers. In those first 2 weeks, you're inundated, right? You're surrounded by people. You're surrounded by love. You're surrounded by compassion. After those first 2 weeks, it kind of starts to taper off and you get the occasional card or the occasional, hey, just checking in. But after about 6 weeks, people forget. We are so forgetful. People are so forgetful. And after about 6 weeks, people start to forget. People not start to, they have forgotten. They're caught up in their own lives. They're busy moving on. And here you are 6 weeks out, and now the grief hits brand new. It hits all over again because now you're alone. Now you're alone. So I waited after my friend's husband passed away for a couple of months. And then I reached out. Hey, would you like to get together? Let's do something. Let's go, let's do whatever. Pick a thing that you enjoy doing with that person. Because it's at that point where the loneliness really hits hard. So I encourage you, if you're not in a moment of grief, but you know someone who is, give yourself that few weeks and then check in with them and then invite them to go do something and then ask them, how can I help? I think that is such a powerful question. Rather than let me know if you need anything, how can I help? How can I support you? I want to remind you, though I'm not a grief coach, I've been there. I get it. I feel it. I know it. I've experienced it. And I'm here for you. How can I support you? Thanks so much for spending a little time with me today on the Lemon Balm Coaching Podcast. I hope you're walking away with something that sparks joy, hope, or a fresh perspective for your journey. If you loved today's episode, let's keep the conversation going. You can find more inspiration, coaching tips, and resources over at my website, lemonbalmcoaching.com. Don't forget to follow me on social media for encouragement and updates, and you'll find me on Instagram and Facebook at Lemon Balm Coaching. And hey, if you're looking for a supportive, uplifting community of amazing women just like you, come join us in the Reignite Your Flame Facebook group. It's a safe, welcoming space where we share, grow, and cheer each other on. And you can find the link on my website or just search for Reignite Your Flame on Facebook. Remember, honey, just be yourself. The world needs what only you have to offer. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode.